Number 1. I have no idea how we got home. To this day it defies logic. I've asked people that were with me. They had not even given it a second thought. Bizarre. I wouldn't consider them to be the type of people to ignore crucial details. But then again, neither am I, and I never even thought to bring it up. Not the next day, not the remainder of our trip, not in the years that followed, not until one night at a casual dinner that we had together some 7 years later. They were just as bewildered as I was. Both of them sat in silence for a moment, bug-eyed, and caught deep in thought. "How the fuck did we get home?" I asked again. I could feel a slight smile tugging lightly at one corner of my mouth as I said it. I knew the answer already. I had pondered it for months. "I don't know," they both said in unison. We all sat in silence again, unsure how to continue the conversation. Well, I suppose I should start at the beginning. The listing of the characters and whatnot. What we were doing, why we were there. Set the scene, I suppose. The couple I was having dinner with are Ben and Stacy, longtime good friends of mine. They are good people. Ben and I had shared a mutual interest in JDM drift cars in my early 20s, and I'd met his partner Stacy not long after he and I had met. In 2005, my girlfriend Tegan and I had been invited to go to England to visit my stepfather, and I had offered for Ben and Stacy to join us. They eagerly accepted and saved up the money to come along. I has always had a fascination for old, creepy, or abandoned properties or houses, and was extremely excited to explore England to see what the country had to offer. Stacy shared my interest in such places, and had expressed her interest in accompanying me should I find anything. Ben and Tegan were not as keen on the idea, but seemed happy to tag along if anything were to eventuate from this. A few days into our trip, I was able to find that there was an old hospital that had been abandoned since the 1980s, but it was soon to be repurposed into a mental health clinic. The hospital in question was around a 2 to 3 hour drive away into rural English countryside. We rented a car, and I spent the best part of an hour explaining to Tegan that if she was going to chicken out on us, it was best that she stay behind. She insisted that she possessed the testicular fortitude to join us, and I, perhaps stupidly, believed her. The rental was not cheap, as we were all under the age of 25, which meant the premium remained in the cost for the rental. Regardless, we split the rental costs between all 4 of us, and we asked my stepfather's partner to drop us off to collect the car from the rental hub. We picked up the car, an absolute piece of shit manual Fiat 500, as it was the cheapest, yet still expensive, option. The rear seats had literally 0% padding for Stacy and Tegan, who had to sit in the back, as I was the driver, and Ben towered above us all, when we set off driving, and using an outdated road map book that my stepfather had lent us. The Navman option had been out of our price range, and let me tell you, I will never ever complain about NSW road posting after trying to navigate around the English countryside. The road map was of minimal help, as it was so ancient that the 3 of the turnoffs that were clearly displayed on its yellowed, weathered pages no longer even existed. Twice, Ben had informed me of an upcoming T intersection that never arrived, and yet we seemed to seamlessly enter into the route that we had planned out regardless. We stopped at a KFC, which was a massive culture shock to us all. No potato and gravy? Baked beans instead? Oh, thank God our ancestors had committed crimes that had them sent to Australia back in the day. Tegan and Stacy were mumbling about the lack of padding on the back seat, which Ben and I brushed off as unnecessary whining. We finished up lunch and set off on the road again. The days are short in England. The sunlight disappears much quicker than back home. I was not particularly bothered, as I just thought it would simply add to the dark atmosphere when we eventually arrived. We arrived in the general vicinity of the hospital after about 2 hours of driving, and said to hell with the road map as it was more trouble than it was worth. We saw some old signposts on bent poles that indicated that we were headed in the right direction and decided to follow them. It took us through a rabbit warren of back roads and dirt tracks, doing U-turns and a lot of swearing until we came across the ruins of a castle-esque type house that had obviously been gutted out from a fire years ago. I decided to stop here to stretch our legs and get some photos. The ruins of this place were amazing. I managed to get some great pictures, although I was only starting out as a photographer, and so they are grainy at best. We lorded around for about 45 minutes before deciding to give the hospital one more crack. We piled into the car and white-knuckled the reading of the road map. Ben and I decided on a likely route before I started the car and we set off. We actually managed to find the hospital this time. Ben had chosen the route well, and I rolled up to a toll booth that was located on the road just outside the hospital grounds. I could see the building in the distance and the plant equipment sectioned off nearby in order to begin demolition or renovations. The security guard at the toll booth did not seem too pleased to see us and was very dismissive. I imagine he turns people away all the time for the very same reason that we were trying to gain entry. I was determined not to give up though. After I did a 3-point turn to get out of the small section of road, I rounded the corner in order to circumvent the patrolled area and entered an estate at the rear entrance of the hospital. Parking the car, I could see that the hospital lay just beyond an open field nearby. The sky was pitch black now. The only lighting was coming from dimly lit street lamps that flickered on and off every few seconds. When I opened the door, I noticed that the air was incredibly cold, and the street was eerily silent. Stacy and I practically leapt out of the car, in anticipation of getting to the hospital, while Ben and Tegan reluctantly opened their respective doors to get out. We all zipped up our jackets and put our scarves on while trudging into the field. The ground was so wet and muddy that we had to use torches on our phones to prevent ourselves from sinking our feet into the foot-deep puddles. Clearly this field had been recently used to move the plant equipment to the area, and as a result, much of the terrain was torn up, with deep turrets from machine tracks. Stacy and I took the lead while Ben and Tegan lagged behind. I did not think too much of it. I knew they were not into this stuff. We walked for about 2 minutes when I heard Ben call out to us. Stacy and I stopped and turned around. "What?" I said as I stood still. A light breeze began to blow now. "Tegan doesn't want to go," Ben said in an apologetic tone. I looked at Tegan. Her head was bowed down towards the ground, and her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. We all stood still for a moment, and I sighed loudly. "Okay, let's go back to the car." Stacy and I were not happy, but we knew that leaving Tegan at the car was not an option, and we wanted everyone to come with us. Stacy let out an audible "damn it" as we began the painstaking journey back to the little Fiat. When we got back to the car, we all silently got in and took a moment to make our clothing a little more comfortable for travel. Now this is where the story gets a little strange. Not much was said between any of us. I started the car and began to drive. We did not discuss a route home, and I had no clue where we were. I just started driving. I found a dirt road and took that. Nobody in the car said a word about this. I noticed a sign haphazardly nailed crookedly to a gnarly-looking tree that said, "London, 40 miles," that somebody had obviously painted and made it home. I continued to drive. I remember nothing about that road, and I don't recall anything until I was at a large intersection back in London. I looked around the car. All of us wore stoic expressions and seemed rather listless, like a damaged VHS tape. We were at a Chinese restaurant near to where my stepfather lived. We were all sitting around a square table with a cheap blue tablecloth. All of a sudden, all 4 of our forks slid off the table and onto the floor. Stacy and I were opposite each other when this had happened, and we glanced at each other with perplexed expressions before bending down to retrieve our forks together. Stacy looked at me again and said, "That was weird." She sounded far off and distant, and as though she was talking underwater. "What?" I asked, straining my ears to hear just as her volume and cadence returned back to normal. "That was weird," she said, clear as day. The bustling noises of a busy restaurant also now returning to fill the void of ambient background noise that I had not even noticed was missing up until that very point. Skip again. Getting into bed and feeling extremely heavy and sedated. We all woke up the next day and seemed perfectly normal. We ate breakfast together, while Ben and I cracked bad jokes off each other, as we always did. We returned the car later that day. After I checked the back seats, after the fuss the girls had made, and yes, they were indeed devoid of any padding, and never spoke of the outing again, not once. Losing hours of time with friends that can verify that they experienced the exact same thing, a subconscious refusal to dwell on it or even bring it up. What the fuck actually happened that night? Number 2. Katai Creek. Before you hear the story, I just want to say that it doesn't have a particularly satisfying climax or ending. It defies all logic and sense, and will probably leave you feeling quite bewildered, as it did to me while it was occurring. Having said that, it's still the creepiest series of events that has ever happened to me. When I was a young teenager, my friend Nathan and I would often take my family's large sea kayak out across the nearby river to a small creek that was around half a kilometer away and shot off adjacent to an abandoned golf course. This creek was very slow-moving compared to the large Hawkesbury River, and as a result of this, a lot of rubbish and debris would collect in the mouth of the creek before slowly being distributed throughout its length. Nathan and I spent a lot of time at this creek. We even built a small jetty to tie the kayak to, using long sticks and balling twine from the hay bales that we used to feed the horses back at home. We used this jetty to moor the kayak while we navigated the mess of prickly pear cacti that guarded the borders of the golf course. The golf course itself was incredibly eerie. No animals, birds, or even insects could be heard or seen on it. Every noise that you made was echoed back at you from a nearby sandstone cliff face. The closest thing that we saw to an animal was the skeleton of a kangaroo, which we found around the second time that we went there. It was strange, as we'd only been to the spot around a week or so prior, and there was no corpse. Yet there, in the middle of the clearing, was a full kangaroo skeleton, sun-bleached and scattered about. We picked up some of the bones and admired them closely, remarking on what part of the skeleton we thought each bone was, before tossing them aside. I took the skull back with me in the kayak, and I placed it on the bookshelf in my room when I got home that afternoon. I often took things back from outings. Nathan never did, but he was always on the lookout for things for me to collect. The next time that we went out to the creek, we decided to try our luck at exploring the waterway as far down as we could. We armed ourselves with machetes and a small hatchet that we had used when we built the jetty and set off. The journey was made extremely difficult by vines that spanned the creek from bank to bank, sunken logs, and dense river weed that made paddling nearly impossible. The water was full of garbage, too. Broken tubes, life jackets, boat propellers, you name it. It had made its way there. As we made it through to the relatively rubbish-free area that had dark, ominous-looking water, I looked down briefly and saw what I thought was a doll's head just below the surface of the water. I stopped paddling to crane my neck to see it more clearly. It was definitely a doll's head, about a foot below the surface, as if it was tethered there from the riverbed. It was looking up with a blank expression and light blue eyes. I instantly got a panicked feeling as I gazed at it. Before I could say anything, Nathan exclaimed, "Oh, cool," and plunged his hand into the water. I could tell that he was surprised at how deep he had to reach to wrap his fingers around the head, but Nathan was a determined dude. He lifted the head out of the water and looked at me grinning, streams of water running from his closed fist as he held it out towards me triumphantly. I took it reluctantly from him. It was a small doll's head, around 3 inches in diameter. The head was clearly sun-damaged, and as a result, it lost a lot of the paint features. There were no discernible pupils on the eyes, just the blue-colored irises. This gave the thing a really disturbing look. I shook my head at Nathan and placed the head on the front of the kayak to look like the figurehead of an old wooden ship. Nathan laughed. "Let's call him Bob," he said while still grinning. I gave him a deadpan look, trying not to laugh. "You're so original," I scoffed at him, before turning around to resume paddling. I stopped immediately when I saw Bob staring straight back at me. I had him placed facing outward. I know that I had because his face creeped me out, and I did not want to look at it. Nathan was paddling while I stopped, and so we were moving at a good pace. As I was at the front of the boat, I was meant to keep an eye out for obstacles and call out if I saw anything ahead. I was entirely focused on Bob, however, as we struck a submerged tree and came to an abrupt stop. Everything on the kayak jumped forward as a result of this. Nathan, me, our packed lunches and water bottles. Nothing too major happened. Everything on the kayak had jumped forward, that is, except for the doll's head. I kept my eye on it the entire time, and it did not move even half an inch. It was like it was superglued to the boat. Nathan began teasing me about being blind, and I snapped at him to be quiet. He asked what was wrong, and I leaned to the right for him to see the head. I pointed and said, "It didn't move, dude." With a half chuckling, Nathan moved forward to look at it closer. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. I picked up my paddle and took a slow stroke backward in the water to lightly hit the tree again. Once again, everything on the kayak jumped forward slightly as we struck the tree, except for Bob. He stayed perfectly still. Nathan laughed. "That's weird," he said, his voice trailing off. I reached out to turn Bob around on his spot, and he turned easily. "Let's go home," I said loudly, trying to wash the area of the heavy feeling that was seeming to settle down upon us. Nathan agreed, and we turned the kayak around to head home. I watched the head like a hawk. Bob never looked back at me on the trip home, though. When we got home, we packed everything that we could into our backpacks and lifted the kayak out of the water. The head was stuffed into my pocket. I had not told Nathan about how creeped out I was of fear that he would give me shit or would give him possible ammunition to play a dumb prank on me with it. Nathan was, and still is, my best friend, and he would absolutely have done that if I told him just as I would to him had the roles been reversed. I decided to just keep my mouth shut about the stupid doll head and hope that Nathan would simply forget about it. We trudged over my neighbor's backyard with the kayak, holding it by the handles at both ends. My pocket started to feel very warm. I stopped listening to Nathan's nonsense and began to focus more on the ever-increasing temperature of the head inside my pocket. Each time I thought, it can't get any hotter. It somehow would. It was not burning, more like the feeling of deep heat as it gets left on. I tried my best to simply ignore it. It was getting dark now, and I really wanted to get home. We docked the kayak in the garage and put away the machetes and hatchets before making our way upstairs for dinner. I took a detour to my room to dump the head out of my pocket and onto my bed, leaving it there while I left my room to join Nathan and my family for dinner. When Nathan and I finished dinner and entered my bedroom to go to sleep later that night, the head was absent from my bottom bunk bed. Granted, my room was a mess, but it should still have been in the cleared spot on my bare mattress. I took a little time to look for it, tossing the blankets and sheets aside and climbing on top to peer down through the gap between the bed and the wall. I could not see it anywhere. I was not concerned that I may not see it again. In fact, I was somewhat relieved that it was gone. However, I had a gnawed feeling that it was still around. Not watching me exactly, but just a presence. Nathan seemed to have forgotten about it, though. He never brought Bob back up again that night, and he climbed up to the top bunk and promptly fell asleep. I lay down on my bed and pulled the bundle of blankets haphazardly up over top of me, falling asleep quickly as well. The next day, I was woken by the sounds of thumping noises coming from nearby outside. I got out of my bed to glance out the window into the front paddock of our property to see my stepfather using the hatchet to hack at a tree stump that was much too large for the minuscule axe. My stepfather was a very smart man, but his grasp of common sense sometimes bordered on the absurd. I yawned, rubbing my eyes, and turned around before opening them. I froze in place. There, on the shelf in front of the kangaroo skull, was Bob, his eyes looking once again directly into mine. I turned to look at Nathan, still sleeping on the top bunk, and instantly jumped up on the railing to punch him hard in the upper arm. He awoke with a pained cry and looked at me with a scowl. "What the hell, man?" he demanded, lifting his other arm to place his palm over the spot that I had struck with the punch. "Like you don't know, you mofo," I said with a half-assed laugh, trying to mask the trembling tone in my voice. Nathan looked incredulously at me. I stared at him to try and see if his stoic expression would falter. It always would when he played pranks. It did not, though. I shook my head and strafed across the railing so that the bookshelf was in his view. I pointed at the top shelf. "You didn't put it there?" I asked quietly. Nathan sat up to get a better look and shook his head. "Nah, man, I would have had him facing outward anyway. You know I would have." I spun my head around so fast that I'm surprised my neck did not break. Sure enough, the head was now facing towards the kangaroo skull, and not outward like before. I began shaking, unable to hold myself on the railing any longer. I dropped to the floor and stormed over to the bookshelf to pick Bob up, and took him out into the kitchen. I stomped on the pedal to open the chrome bin in there, and threw him in there a lot harder than I needed to. I did not let the lid naturally close, instead choosing to slam it shut as a good measure. Nathan sleepily trudged out of my room once I had finished doing this. He stared wide-eyed at the bin. He took a moment before looking at me and speaking. "Yeah, that thing was creepy as hell, man." I was glad that Nathan agreed with me and was not using this opportunity to make fun of me. I nodded at him. "Something about it was just wrong," I uttered quietly. Nathan playfully kicked the bin, making it rock a little. "Take that, creepy-ass doll-head guy," he exclaimed while laughing. I laughed too, feeling glad that the situation was over and dealt with. I asked Nathan again if he had actually put the head on the shelf, stating that if he had it, it was okay. It was a good prank. I just needed to know for my own sanity. Nathan put his hand over his heart and sternly promised that he had not done it. I believed him then, and still do to this day, nearly 17 years later. Months went past. Nathan and I never had an opportunity to make our way back to the creek. With school holidays approaching, I was keen to get big chores out of the way so on weekends I could enjoy the full extent of the holiday period. I did this by working on weekends with my stepfather on various projects on our rural property. We used the machetes and hatchet that Nathan and I had taken on our last trip to the creek in order to complete many of these tasks. Having no means to sharpen the tools, or even the knowledge for that matter, meant that the cutting and hacking got more difficult and cumbersome as time went on. One day I was fighting my way through a thicket of vines hanging from a large peppercorn tree. I observed my mother lean down to pick an object up out of the dirt in the front paddock. It was in a spot directly below the main household wheelie bins that the council picked up weekly. I thought nothing of it. A few hours later I went inside to get a drink of water, and to change my shirt, as I had managed to create a large tear in the one that I was wearing. I entered my room and immediately felt strange, feeling a need to look over my bookshelf. The feeling of deja vu was intense. Bob was back, staring at me again from the spot on the bookshelf that I had placed him on years earlier. This time, though, a small smirk was obvious on his features. I felt nausea sweep over me, and I turned around to walk back into the kitchen. "Mom?" I asked sheepishly. My mother didn't look up from doing the dishes. "Yes, honey?" she replied. "Did you put something on my shelf?" Mom murmured in agreement with me. Yes, I found that doll's head in the front yard earlier. I saw it in your room earlier in the year, and figured you had lost it somehow. This made no sense to me. Mom could not have seen it in my room. There was no time for her to do it. Furthermore, what a bizarre thing to do, to find a doll's head underneath the retaining wall that our bin sat atop of, and think to wash it off and put it on my bookshelf. I shook my head and turned to walk back to my room, determined to get rid of him for good this time. I marched straight up to the bookshelf and reached to grab Bob, and paused. He was not there. I let out an exasperated sigh and began to violently push things aside on my bookshelf, first on the top shelf, then the second shelf, all the way down until starting to fling things around in my room. He was nowhere to be found. I stopped and placed my hands on either side of my face and took a minute to slow my breathing down. I walked briskly out of my room and grabbed the cordless phone off of the wall. I called Nathan to tell him what had happened. When I had finished rattling off the summary of what had happened, he was speechless about what I told him. We both had no idea what to make of all this. My stepfather, growing impatient with how long I was taking to come back, had returned to the house also, and was standing over me with his hands on his hips, looking very annoyed. I told Nathan I had to go and hung up. My stepfather asked me where I had put the hatchet that I was using earlier. I looked confused. I had left it impaled into the impossibly large tree stump as always. He had watched me do it. I told him as much, and he said he could not find it. We both went down to the paddock together, and sure enough, just like Bob, the hatchet had seemingly disappeared. I never saw Bob again, but the story does not end there. Years later, when Nathan and I were in our 20s, we decided to take the kayak and make our way back down to the creek for old time's sake. We took the kayak out of the garage and carried it up the road to a launch ramp, as a neighbor's property that we used to use to get to the river had changed owners some years back. It took us about an hour to get to the creek, as opposed to our usual 20 minutes back in the day. When we arrived, we were very surprised to see that our jetty was still there, having survived 2 floods and over a decade of river tides. It honestly did not look like it was damaged in any way, almost like new. We stopped and moored the kayak to it, as we had always done, and stepped out into the shore. My foot kicked something up in the dirt, and I looked down to see the outline of a familiar shape. It couldn't be. I knelt down and grabbed at the handle of the object, pulling it out of the crumbling earth to reveal the hatchet that I had misplaced so many years ago. The casing bearing my stepfather's monogram embossed into the dark leather. I shook my head. That was impossible. This hatchet was the only one we had purchased, and it was one of a kind. Nathan and I were the only ones that visited this spot out of my family and anyone else that we knew. This made no sense whatsoever. Nathan looked at it quietly along with me, a heavy feeling seeming to settle around us once again. We both turned to look at the wide berth of still water at the mouth of the creek. In the center, the bloated and rotting corpse of a cow floated innocuously, drifting lazily in a clockwise direction. A storm was setting in rapidly. Nathan and I looked at each other at the same time and knew this was the last time we would ever be coming to Kaitai Creek. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.